Hey everybody. So sorry about the mistake with the live stream on YouTube. It might be the case that I end up doing more of these kind of pre-recorded videos and then open up an attempt or a way for you all to maybe ask me some questions and then I can respond in comments or this sort of thing. Not sure. Again, so many of us are playing this by ear. We're going to try and be relaxed about these sorts of things. Anyway, let me get to the important thing, which is going over the content from our first reading from Aristotle on virtue theory. And let's get you thinking about some of that stuff. Okay. So I'm going to look down at my notes here. I've tried to be a little bit more organized, maybe, than I have been in the past. I don't know. Since this sort of mode of interaction is new for me, I tend not to be able to use those cues, having students in class, looking at them, looking at their faces, to be able to know when the things that I'm saying are making sense, when I might need to stop and back up or repeat a certain idea. So we'll deal with the limitations of the technology and the presenter, the guy talking to you right now, as we go. Again, suggestions, anything like that I'd be more than willing to take them. So what are we talking about? In this last month of classes or so basically the month of April, except for the stuff that we're going to do on humor, we're focusing on ethics, which is one of the four main branches of philosophical study. The other three being metaphysics, ontology, which is kind of the study of what there is and how the world is and what the universe is made of and this sort of thing. The second one being epistemology, which is study of knowledge. How do we know? What do we know? Those sorts of things. And metaphysics and epistemology tend to be the big heavy hitters traditionally in Western style philosophy. And then you have logic, which we really haven't done much of exactly in this class, but we have used logical principles when we talk about argument. And then, of course, the last one is ethics. And the main questions that are involved when you do ethical studies, and while you might think of moral philosophy, the study of morality, traditionally the philosophers have used the term ethical studies or ethics to talk about this sort of subject matter. It's not that big a deal if you slide in between the two. I would never count off on a test or anything sort of thing. But interestingly, the word ethics is related to the word etiquette, and we know that etiquette relies on, or relates to, I should say, manners and how we interact with one another. So ethics, in one sense, is a study of manners, how we interact, and maybe what the right ways to interact are. So what's the right fork to use at the dinner table, right? So many of you may have to go out on an interview dinner, and you might not know which fork or which knife to use and at what time. Here's a quick tip. Just follow the person who's kind of in charge of the dinner, and you really can't go wrong anywhere. There's my little side note on etiquette. But it's also that is the Greek word etika, right? The Latin word mores is more related to morality. They focus on the same thing. Mores really talked about the customs of a particular group of people, but that's the same thing. Etiquette is a system of customs. The general questions that are driving people who do ethical research generally are involved. What is the good? How do we know the good? How do we define what the good is, and those sorts of things. For Aristotle, it's a little bit different. He does want to know what the good is by understanding virtues, but more importantly, he thinks that virtues help us lead a good life. So one question that you often hear in ethics or in people who worry about these sorts of things is, how does one lead a good life? How does one lead a rewarding life? How does one lead a life that is worth leading? Those are all ethics questions. And ultimately, Aristotle is going to try and answer that by talking about virtue. Now, some of the things that you may want to understand are, just to kind of give you a heads up on what we're doing in the class and how we're going, is that there are four main ethical approaches. And this is not an exhaustive list, so don't worry about it. But the first one is virtue theory, of which Aristotle is one of the historically leading figures in this discussion. There are others that we'll cover. There's utilitarianism, who the main authors behind those historically, again, are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And we will read John Stuart Mill in class and talk about, or in class, I guess. And we'll talk a bit about what utilitarianism is. The third one is called deontology, or duty theory, and this is one espoused mostly by Kant. and can be, used to do kind of liberal Western style thinking. And then the fourth one, some people argue whether or not it's really a true class on its own, or it's a subclass of duty theory, is called divine command theory. So what is right is that which what the God tells you. So the Ten Commandments sort of thing. We won't do that because we've essentially treated that when we did the Euthyphro in trying to understand, what makes a thing pious, what makes it religiously good. And for the Greeks, in certain ways, the idea of the religiously good is the good. So we dealt with it, though you guys just didn't know that we dealt with it. So those are the four main things. So a little note about reading Aristotle. It may feel to you jumpy. It may feel to you a little kind of broken up or choppy. And there's a reason for that. A lot of these bits of writing of Aristotle were lecture notes that he used to present to his students, because he, like Plato, formed a school there in Athens, Greece, way back in the day. He was actually the tutor of Alexander the Great, historical tidbit. And while Aristotle did apparently write dialogues like Plato's, they haven't been, they weren't kept up in history. And the problem might have been that they were bad. So none of his students wanted his name sullied by, carrying on with his stuff. So we have, these books and these things that you read that are sometimes written at one point in Aristotle's time of his life, and then he comes back to it later on. So sometimes you just have to kind of very slowly put these things together. And Aristotle, like a lot of this stuff, is not necessarily an easy read, but he does have some fundamentally good ideas that have stuck with folks in a lot of ways. He's been very influential. So one of the first things to understand is that he wants us to talk and understand what virtues of thought and character are. How's the best way to understand them? And because he approaches this in a way different than Plato did, or different than many, he doesn't really kind of launch in and say, okay, this is what a virtue is. This is what a virtue of thought is. This is what a virtue of character is. And then give you a definition and then proceed to give you examples. His is a very different approach. His is a more kind of, well, if we're going to try and find out about virtues, maybe we kind of ought to think about where virtues happen in the world. So one of the general ideas about Aristotle is Aristotle was one of the first empiricists. He really looked at the world to try and draw his ideas to understand what virtue is. If you want to understand what virtue is, go see how people are talking about virtue and develop from there. Whereas Plato was much more interested in trying to understand what the pure form was. So Plato was worried about the heavens, and Aristotle was worried about the earth. Take that for what it's worth. It's not going to be terribly interesting to you, I think, but it's at least worth telling you so that you understand a little bit of what's going on in his work and the background to his work. So one of the first things he does, he says, well, let's kind of break that up. We know we have virtues. We have virtues of thought and we have virtues of character. And those are different sorts of things. So, but since they're both virtues, there's probably something similar about them. What is it that's similar about them? For him, you can be trained and be a virtuous carpenter. You can be a virtuous person who practices any sort of skill. So take the skill of rapping. I don't tend to have that skill, but lots of people do. And you can develop that skill through practice. And Aristotle's right. You don't just become a good house builder overnight. You have to build houses and learn to do the craft well, learn from your mistakes, and figure out what works and what doesn't work. And he thinks that the same thing happens of virtues of character. That is, you can develop them, he calls them habituate to them over time, and you can be trained to be virtuous. And that's important because what that means is that any person, no matter how they're born, can learn to be and be trained to be virtuous. So that's kind of a similarity, right? You've got this notion that there are virtues of thought and virtues of character. And while both of them need training to be increased, but there's an important difference. And here's the difference, and we'll kind of get into that. Think about the virtue of rapping, right? There are people who can rap really fast, and they're very good at rhyming, and they use all sorts of rhyming patterns. And then there are people who rap kind of slowly, and they're much more kind of laid back in their approach. And both are equally good, but it's a different skill set to become good at one versus becoming good at the other. And you can be good at both, right? I'm good at neither. Anyhow, you can learn to be a good carpenter. You can learn to be a good rapper. You can learn to be a good basketball player through practice, trial and error, and dedication. But that's not going to necessarily mean you're a virtuous person. It just means you're good at that. You have the virtue of being a good basketball player, a good carpenter, a good rapper, and so on and so forth. But to have the virtue of being a good and virtuous person, there's more to it than that, right? There's something different. And he gets at it this way. The virtuous person must not only just do the virtuous act, but they must do the virtuous act as the virtuous person would do them. You're probably thinking, well, that doesn't really help me, Aristotle, because I'm trying to figure out what virtue is, and you just told me it's a practice, but not only do I have to do it, but I have to do it as the virtuous person would do. And since I have no idea what virtue is, I have no clue how the virtuous person would do it. And he says, actually, you do. And it's going to be pretty clear to you in a second what that is. But to give you this notion of what the virtuous person would do, think of it against like the basketball player. Do you have to train to drain that hook shot as the basketball player would do it? Or do you just have to train to drain the hook shot? In a skill base and simply something like basketball or rapping or, what was the other one that I used? Basketball or rapping or house building. Like I wouldn't ever think about how would a carpenter do this sort of thing, right? I just do what works, do what I know or what I think works, and there you go. I've got a straight wall. I've got a good hook shot. I've got a wonderful rhyme and meter for my next song. But in morals, in ethical behavior, it's different, and it's fundamentally different. So one way, and I'll use this example later when we talk about Kant, is to think of this example. I know that many of you, when you were in school, participated in some sort of canned food drive or some drive for things for the homeless, whether it be socks or toiletries or this sort of thing. And oftentimes what you did as a kid was maybe go around to your family and friends and people perhaps in your neighborhood, and you got them to agree to give you X numbers of cans of food or X numbers of toiletries for every mile that you walked in this walkathon. Now, as a kid, and even me into high school, what I was really interested in was the fact that we might have gotten a pizza party or we were going to get out of class. I wasn't terribly interested in knowing that the basic moral problem that we were addressing, homelessness or food shortages and this sort of thing, were being taken care of. I was more worried about getting out of school. And so while I did a good thing, I behaved virtuously in that I did things to help ameliorate a bad condition. I didn't really care about it. So I didn't behave as the virtuous person would. If in order for that act of giving food to the homeless to really mean something, to be considered virtuous, I had to have done it with kind of the intention to address that issue, with the idea of acting and behaving in a moral fashion. So that's how one can do the virtuous thing as the virtuous person would do it. If you're just doing it because you want to get money off if you're only donating to charity to get money off your taxes, well, you're not really donating charity for the right reason. You should give it because you think it's a good thing to do, or it is a good thing to do. Those can be different. You should be helping you should be helping your professor learn how to do these things better so that the next time there's a worldwide pandemic, he doesn't look so flat-footed, right? You do it because it's the right thing to do. Here's a little self-promotion here. You do the course evaluations and you give them your attention because you know that you should, because I get information from those things, right? You don't do them just to do them to get them out of your way. If that's going to be the case, then don't do them, right? Because you're not doing them with the right intent, the right frame of mind. This is exactly what Aristotle's talking about when he means, I need you to understand how to do the good thing as the good person, how to do the virtuous thing as the virtuous person would do. That's it. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is okay. All right. So, yeah, I get that. So hopefully right now you understand that being a good basketball player, while difficult and requiring practice, being a good human, a virtuous human, yes, it requires practice, but it also requires something else. You can't just be doing it. You have to be doing it for certain reasons. And without that, you can't be virtuous. Now, we still haven't figured out what virtue is just yet. So again, Aristotle's kind of stepping our way into this sort of thing. But because he wants us to understand virtue kind of as it sets and how it influences and our behavior, well, there are some different things that we can do. So you've got to be able to be trained, and you've got to be able to do this from an early age. Aristotle, like Plato, thought that training a person early on is going to make them become a more virtuous person easier. And at a certain point, if you haven't that sort of training, you're not going to become virtuous, right? When he moves on to section 2, which is on habituation, which is over on page 88, he's talking about that sort of thing where you learn to do it, but then you also learn the reasons why. So think about one of, fifth graders or fourth graders or even third graders understanding the real reasons behind giving food to the homeless, or giving toiletries to the homeless. So they understand that if there are needs and those needs aren't filled, that we should help people. But as you grow up and as you grow older, when you really understand that the reason that you're doing this is that so people don't have to live in bad conditions that harm their health, that harm their person, well, now you're starting to do it as a virtuous person. You're beginning to see what's going on in the moral realm. And you can be trained to do that. So first thing we get you doing is getting a good feeling from doing these good deeds, right? So we have you do it. We give you a pizza party so you feel good about helping the homeless. The next time that you have to do this, you might not need that reinforcement from getting a free pizza party. You might not need to get a tax break or a tax rebate in order to give to charity. Not because it doesn't feel good to get those things. It's great. And if it happens, right on, take advantage. But if you don't need them, then it's really important. And now you've made a different sort of move. You are starting to behave in a much more virtuous fashion because the acts are driven not by the reward, but because you know that it's right. And that's an important move for him, right? But this notion of reward and pain and pleasure, which he starts talking about in section 3, is important because what he's going to say, and he says this, and I'm going to look away and read to you. He says, but we must take someone's pain and pleasure or pain following on his or her actions to be a sign of his or her state, their state. For if someone who abstains from bodily pleasures enjoys the abstinence itself, he's temperate. If he is grieved by it, he is intemperate. So think about, I'll use myself as an example. One of the things that the kind of the shelter in place stuff has really done at the moment has curtailed my ability to go out and get all the sweets that I like to eat. I love chocolate. I love cookies. And what my wife and I have decided is that we're trying to, break our habits because we don't have as much easy access to it. And it's hard, right? And I get a little bummed out when I don't have my sugar. Sometimes I get a headache and whatnot, right? If Aristotle would worry that if this is bothering me, if I feel bad about the abstinence, then I'm not temperate. And I think it's fairly clear that when it comes to sweets, I'm not temperate. I tend to eat them, and when they get in the house, I eat them up, and I eat them up quickly, and that's not a good thing. So the same thing could be say for drugs or alcohol. Like if you're at home and you're missing all the weed that you could smoke while you were at college and it's bothering you, Aristotle might worry that you're not temperate. So what you can see now is that if he's using temperate as an example, you know that to be temperate is to have a virtue. So now, through his examples, and Aristotle does this a lot when he writes, is he reasons around examples. So he says, here is temperance. And we all know that temperance is a good thing. We shouldn't be eating. People who don't, need to eat a lot, and this is going to become important a little bit later, people who don't need to eat a lot because their life doesn't demand much calories out of them on a day-to-day, shouldn't be eating a lot, right? It leads to health outcomes. It leads to being overweight and so on and so forth. You need to exercise, and you need to exercise enough to keep yourself healthy, but not so much that you harm your health. And he talks about this. You can have an excess of exercise, and it will put you in places where you have developed problems, like you hurt your back, or maybe you develop bad knees, or you use improper form and you continue to do so and you stress out a shoulder, or this sort of thing. Good amounts of exercise are good things. They're virtuous, but too much of it is bad and too little of it is bad, right? But what he says, the virtue of character is about pleasures and pains, right? We've got to understand this. He says, pleasure causes us to do base actions, evil actions, and pain causes us to abstain from fine ones. Oftentimes, the reason we don't do the right thing is because it's hard. It's difficult. It causes us pain, so we don't do it. Because that is why we need to have the appropriate upbringing from the early youth, as Plato says, to make us find enjoyment or pain in the right things, right? And this is a corrective education. So one of the things I wished I'd learned a little bit more when I was younger was the value of exercise, and not just kind of getting out there and, putting on a little sweat, but like real exercise where your muscles are burning, or you're really, you're huffing and puffing real hard, and come to enjoy that sort of thing, right? Because it would have been easier later on in life to do that sort of thing, right? I exercise fairly regularly, but it took me a while to kind of get my head to the point where I looked forward to, the difficult times that exercise can bring. Got so bad that I did CrossFit for a while, but then my knees went bad, so couldn't do that. He said, one of the things that you need to realize about virtues is that virtues, to be a virtuous person, is to do being human well. And I know that sounded a little awkward, but to be a good basketball player, the virtue of basketball is to be a good basketball player. The virtue of rap is to be a good rapper. The virtue of being human is to be a good human. So every activity has an end. Basketball, be a good basketball player. Carpenter, build good houses. Human, be a good human. Now, what does that take? Obviously, we know that it has something to do with temperance and some other things. But what does that take? So one of the things, and this is going to kind of be the last main point that Aristotle talks about, especially from pages, say, 92 to 100, is this notion of virtue as a mean. M-E-A-N. A mean between two extremes relative to the individual. So, little hand movement. So the mean is in the middle, and over here you have an excess, and over here you have a deficiency. So think about honesty. It's one of the ones he uses, and it's one that often people talk about, the various virtues that are out there. Honesty happens to be one of them. So he says that a mean relative to two extremes, and adding on relative to the individual, that is the proper virtuous behavior. So what does all that mean? So think about someone who is too honest, who is just brazenly honest, right? So if I'm one of those persons and my kids come up to me with their artwork and they say, "Hey, daddy, look at my artwork, look at my art, isn't it great?" Now look, my kids inherited my artistic ability, which is pretty much Zippo, right? They don't draw terribly well, and it's fine. It frustrates my youngest son no end. But if I were to look at the art and honestly say, "That's awful. Justin, come on, man. Like, you couldn't stay in the lines. Your color coordination is awful." If you want to see an example of this, a humorous example, I invite you to Google the following phrase: "I am better than your kid's artwork." It's sick and funny all at the same time. But you'll get a sense of someone who's overly honest. Imagine walking into your friend and you're just kind of saying, "Hey, what's up?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, my dog died, and then my mom got in it," and they just let out all the bad things that happened. And if it was just passing in the cafeteria, right, maybe that's not the place. So you can be too honest, and you can also be not honest enough, a liar. Politicians, a particular one that's in the office, does a lot of that, right? And we don't think that that's virtuous behavior. What he wants you to understand is that you don't have to tell the truth in all cases. Many of us lie for a variety of reasons. Professors, so to give you an example, when a student comes into me and I say something like, maybe you ought to think about, figuring out how to write a little bit better. In my head, what I'm thinking is, wow, you really have some serious issues. But I'm soft pedaling it so that I don't freak the student out. And I understand that I understood this a little bit better. I was getting some therapy done on my knees, and when I went in to get the therapy done, they were checking my flexibility, and they said, "Huh, you really need to work on your flexibility." And in my head, I was like, "Oh my God!" They're thinking to themselves, "How did this person ever survive being this inflexible?" I don't know. I'm still here, so I've been working on my flexibility. But notice we oftentimes will soft pedal things out of respect for someone's feelings. And Aristotle's perfectly fine with that being okay, right? If you're a politician, it may mean, in order to get political things done, that you're not quite as forthright and honest. That may be part and parcel of the political gig. I'm not entirely sure if that's true, but someone could make the case. So again, what you want to understand about a virtue for Aristotle is a mean between two extremes, an excess and a deficiency, that is relative to the individual. Now, with the honesty one, I really didn't get to talk much about the relative to the individual. I just couldn't do it. The honesty one doesn't really, the politician thing kind of got at it. But the better one is an example that he uses of Milo the wrestler and how much food he eats. Now, you don't know who Milo the wrestler is. Apparently, he was a really famous wrestler back in Athens, Greece. But I'm going to give you another example that you probably will understand, which is the guy Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, right? So think of what The Rock has to eat in order to maintain the physique that he maintains. He's probably packing in 6,000 calories a day, right? Because he's working out so much. What is a proper amount of food, what is a virtuous amount of food for him, is an excess between, or is a mean between the excess of eating too much and the deficiency of not eating enough. Now, if he were to take in the calories that I take in on a daily basis, he would lose that physique. So clearly that would not be virtuous for him, right? But if he ate too much, he would get too big and lose the same physique, right? So he has to understand that it's an excess and a deficiency, but it's based on his own background. Two more examples may help to get this out. Bravery is an example that Aristotle uses to kind of describe virtues. So what is the excess of bravery? Foolhardiness. What is the deficiency of bravery? Cowardice, or being cowardly. But how do you judge if someone is brave relative to an excess and a deficiency and themselves? My example, using me as the example here, I'm a 25-year practitioner of martial arts. I've got a 4th degree black belt. I can handle myself in certain ways. Now, if someone were to attack me and I put them down, and I really put them down, and I maybe lost my temper and hurt them a lot, I could be found to be having committed an illegal act, because the expectation is that since you know martial arts and you have so much practice and you have these skills, you should be able to use them and handle them better than you did here. Now, if it had been, say, someone who didn't have that experience, who was much smaller or was afraid for his or her or their life, and they responded to an attacker and they went too far, they're not going to experience the same sort of, complaint against their behavior as I might or as I should. Again, what's cowardly for them and what's cowardly for me are different things, right? If I ran away, and I could have saved or I could have defended myself, that would be cowardly. If a person who has no experience ran away and was completely outmatched because the person was 6'7" and they were 5'2" and all of 100 pounds, that makes sense. To call them brave, not brave, based on what I would do is unfair to them. So this notion of a mean in between an excess and a deficiency relative to an individual is what makes Aristotle's approach, his ethical approach in virtue theory, so interesting, because it takes into account, I should say, a lot of different ideas, so that people could be virtuous and yet not have exactly the same behavior because of a certain background, right? Your culture might not value certain forms of honesty. So the ancient Spartans would send their young men when they were teenagers out, and they would starve them essentially and make them steal their food. But the whole point was so that they would learn to be deceitful and not get caught, because if they got caught, they got their butts beat. But the idea behind this was that you created in someone, the Spartan warrior, someone who's going to be devious, who's going to be single-minded, who's going to get things done and not necessarily get caught. Those are all good things in a theater of war sometimes. Anyways, so that gives you an idea of a mean relative to an individual between an excess and a deficiency. So here's the assignment. I want you to come up with 8 virtues, and you are not allowed to use honesty or bravery, because we've already talked about those. And tell me, identify the virtue, give me the name, and then give me the excess and the deficiency, right? There should be words that fit. So whereas with bravery, we have, if you're brave, the deficiency is cowardice, and the excess is foolhardiness, right? Look at the other virtues. It's really easy to go find them. You know, there are plenty of them out there, right? So just take a second. This is just a simple exercise. It's going to be pretty minimal. It's going to be pretty minimal by way of effort. Just got to identify virtues and then come up with an excess and a deficiency. So if you've got 8 virtues and you've got to add 16 more excesses and, well, 8 excesses and 8 deficiencies for each, you've got what? What's 8 times 3? I don't know. You figure it out. But you get it. 8 times 3 is 24, right? Yeah. 16, 24. Yeah, that's right. So find 24 words and pair them and put them in an ordered set of 3. The virtue, the excess, and the deficiency. Right. Just make it so that I understand. And I'll put this on Blackboard. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll talk to you next time, and have a good night or day or whatever.